All right, so we had a discussion in class the other day about which culture we'd most like to live in, whether it was hunter-gatherer, Neolithic farmer, or modern civilization. And if you remember, I first said that I wanted to live in a hunter-gatherer society, but I was thinking about it and I remembered the Bedouins that I visited in Petra, Jordan. They're like Arab sheep herders. And I was there when they had a wedding and all the women were engaging in the high-pitched vibrato. It's called ululation. I don't know if you've heard that before, but it's very high-pitched and loud. And us men were sitting on the ground outside eating some rice and goat out of a big platter with our hands. And their lifestyle, at least before the modern era, was very simple. They just herded their sheep to a location with new grass every few weeks. And then they set up their tent and just sat there like this guy. And to me, that would be the ideal life. And I experienced a little bit of that life when I was in college. I was working at a car wash gas station during the gas crisis of the 1970s when there were long lines of people trying to buy a limited amount of gas at gas stations. However, almost nobody came to our gas station because you could only buy 5 gallons of gas at a time, and you had to buy a car wash along with it. So I just sat there all afternoon with nothing to do, and it was great. I'm kind of like this guy, possibly. The only downside of the job was the occasional angry person who came in demanding more gas. And I remember one guy who said he was from the mafia and that he was going to come back and get me. But there's always a downside to every job. And likewise, the Bedouins in the old times had to defend their sheep against the occasional jaguar. Nevertheless, I still think I would like to be a Bedouin more than any other culture. So while a family such as this might survive with a small herd, a particularly strong and synergistic economic strategy was to combine crop production with animal husbandry in a village. And livestock could help with the farming tasks, and crops could help feed the animals. And this type of agricultural system caused a revolution in the ability of humans to support large populations. And it also enabled the development of sedentary villages rather than people constantly moving in the search for food. And in 1935, Australian archaeologist Gordon Childe referred to the development of agriculture in the Middle East and the ability to support large populations as the Neolithic Revolution, where Neolithic means New Stone Age, and where there was a revolution in the lifestyle of people in the Middle East. So the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was great while it lasted. Just go out and collect some vegetation and spear a few animals. However, the natural environment could only supply food for 10 million people worldwide. And out of necessity, agriculture arose when food needs increased with increasing population or when food supply decreased with drought. And Neolithic revolutions happened at different times in different parts of the world. In the Middle East, they domesticated wheat and barley about 11,700 years ago. And at the same time, the Chinese Neolithic revolution began. They domesticated rice. And these domestications did not happen overnight. Like rice was finally domesticated in about 9,000 years ago. So it might take thousands of years to breed the favorable traits into plants and animals that made them most suitable for human consumption. In South America, they domesticated potatoes and tomatoes. Africans domesticated yams, and North American, Native Americans domesticated squash and sunflower. So the blue lines show how the initially domesticated crops were spread. So here's the Middle East, where it was initially, wheat was initially domesticated, and then it spread to like England, Spain, Europe, into Africa. Here's the spread of rice. throughout East Asia. Here's the spread of potatoes in Peru and the spread of corn in Mexico, and then squash and sunflowers in America. So once people figured out how to do this, other people took advantage of it. So after the introduction, I'll describe a community that was prior to the Neolithic Revolution, but practiced agriculture. It's Ohalo 2, which was an early village along the Sea of Galilee. And then 14-3 describes the Natufians who lived in the same region between 15,000 and 12,000 years ago. And they, although they didn't plant crops, they harvested wild wheat in the region and invented sickles and other technologies like to process the grains. In section 14-4, we'll talk about the first Neolithic revolution in the Middle East, which began 11,700 years ago with small settlements near springs down in the Jordan Valley, which if you don't know, it's like below sea level. So there's mountains on either side and springs flow in from the side. And this culture is called pre-pottery Neolithic A, and there's evidence of domestication of crops, but not of animals in this culture. And then section 14-5 describes the process of animal domestication in the Middle East and around the world. And this is actually the section that most students are usually interested in this chapter. And then Jericho was abandoned, or actually pre-pottery Neolithic A was in Jericho. And then Jericho was abandoned for about 1,000 years. And then section 14-6 describes the people who occupied Jericho in 9200 BC, which are classified as pre-pottery Neolithic B. And they had both crop and animal domestication. And then other villages in the region also combined them. And that was the most effective economic strategy. Section 14-7 describes the Neolithic Revolution in China, which began at the same time as the Neolithic Revolution in the Middle East and was the origin of the famous Yellow River civilization. Section 14-8 describes the Neolithic Revolution in the Americas, which actually included domestication of plants, but not of animals. And then section 14-9 describes the late Neolithic Ubaid, who originated in southern Mesopotamia in 5700 BC or 7,700 years before the present. And they were the founders of the first civilization in world history, which was the Uruk culture. So as I said before, agricultural productivity is dramatically higher than natural ecosystem productivity. So as I said, prior to the advent of agriculture, the world could only support a total of 10 million people, or an average of a few hunter-gatherers per square mile. And then this table describes the number of people who could be supported per square mile with different sources of food. So early cropping methods would be 30 people per square mile, up to 150. And then intensive irrigated agriculture, such as in Mesopotamia and Egypt, would be between 300 and 2,600 people per square mile could be supported. And then modern farming is really not that much more than the early intensive irrigated agriculture. It's between 2,600 and 5,200 people per square mile. So now you can see why we could go from 10 million to 10 billion. And then greenhouses, and actually there was a greenhouse in Rome. That's why I said they're 2,000 years old. But the modern growth of the greenhouse industry is very dramatic. And actually, our department does some research on greenhouses and what are called vertical farms, where you can actually stack lettuce trays, like 12 trays high, inside a warehouse and use artificial light above each tray. And so really the sky's the limit as far as how many people you could support per square mile, because you could just keep stacking lettuce trays higher and higher. You could even have a whole building, like a skyscraper filled with lettuce. And so that's becoming very popular now, where they're producing lettuce in cities. And so they don't have the environmental cost of transporting lettuce across the country. Okay, so there's advantages and disadvantages with growing crops. So while food production goes up dramatically, agriculture, especially crop production, was not a paradise, but it was hard and backbreaking work. And so hunter-gatherers actually had healthier bones and teeth than those in early agricultural groups growing crops. So cultivation, seeding, weeding, and harvesting all required extensive time and human energy. Nevertheless, archaeological studies indicate that people had more time in these early agricultural communities for pursuits such as making crafts and art objects. So the invention of animal-powered cultivation systems, such as the ox and plow, transferred much of the work to animals. But agriculture was still laborious, and as a result, civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt developed class systems and slavery in order to produce food. So maybe, I can't remember if it's 30% or 60% of the population was going out in the fields every day and conducting agriculture. But that freed up the other 40% to do other things like administration, controlling the slaves, math, other things that civilization developed, which wouldn't have happened without civilization. So almost all domesticated farm animals were first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. So that's this region. And one possible reason for that is that animals suitable for domestication lived in this region. I mean, that's what a lot of people think. Maybe there's other reasons too. But anyway, I think it started with like the domestication of sheep 13,000 years ago and then continued on from there. So I guess people got the idea of it and then they thought, well, we could domesticate other animals. Maybe that's what happened. So this is a satellite view of the Fertile Crescent. And so this region is called the Levant. So this is like Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria. Uh, so archaeologists call this region the Levant. These are the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. So you can see that the Fertile Crescent is the green going around here. And so there's also the Zagros Mountains in Iran. So those regions had enough rainfall for rain-fed agriculture, which I think is about 30 centimeters a year, or about 1 foot of rainfall. Doesn't sound like enough, but that's usually the line they draw for rain-fed agriculture is at the 30 centimeter line. So there's like I think it's called an isohyetograph, where you have the same amount of rainfall above it. In Mesopotamia, they didn't have hardly any rainfall. It was very dry and hot, so it's near sea level. But that became the start of the first civilizations, the Uruk culture and then the Sumerians. So in those cases, they needed to develop irrigation. And they also developed the plow. So those were the two keys to the development of agriculture, was at a large scale for civilizations, was irrigation and the plow. So, okay, so let's move on to section 14-2. And this was the Ohalo 2 culture, which preceded the Neolithic Revolution by about 10,000 years. So they lived right down here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee by the exit to the Jordan River. And then this is the Jordan Valley to the south. And their village was recently uncovered by a drought. So Lake Galilee fell by 10 feet during the drought, and it revealed the Ohalo 2 village, which had been underwater, but then was uncovered, and then archaeologists did a lot of studies on it. So scientists found lots of evidence of agricultural involvement in this little village just by excavating under one of these huts. And actually the huts weren't still there, but where the huts had been built. And so it was a nice flat area here. It was near wetlands and near the sea. So there was lots of sources of food. There's a lot of animal life that lives in wetlands, and then obviously fish in the lake. But the Ohalo 2 people were really ahead of their time. Their huts were among the first known examples of constructed shelters. They also had the first known bedding. So before that, there was no beds. One hut had a grinding stone on which they had crushed seeds in the process of food preparation. And archaeologists actually found 90,000 seeds on the floor, including wheat, barley, and oats. And the shapes of the seeds indicates that they were already breeding for desired characteristics. So, for example, the wheat staying on the stalk when they harvested it or coming off, there are certain things that they desired. And when they found variants that were positive, they would breed those. Researchers also found weeds at the site, which you might be surprised that that was interesting information, but that actually means they were cultivating soil and planting crops. So the reason there's weeds is that we cultivate soil and provide an environment for weeds. They also produced the first known sickles in world history, and researchers found two types of sickles there that were used to harvest the grains. The knives were held by hand, and they had other blades that were mounted in a handle. There were also bones of fish and animals at the site, which indicate, as with many early agricultural communities, they utilized whatever food they could get a hold of. So they would, use the wheat and barley that they harvested for food, but they'd also hunt wild animals, and they'd probably also go pick, fruit or nuts on trees and so on. And so they did an analysis of one of the skeletons from there, and the skeleton indicated that he threw and thrust spears at game or fish. So this picture shows, right here, the people heading off to the hills in the morning in order to harvest wheat from the dried grasses in the hills. So this might be a typical early morning scene. Unfortunately, these people vanished and all their technologies were lost. Archaeologists do not know what happened to these residents, but if, they do know that a fire destroyed the huts. So possibly another group just attacked them and killed them and burned the village. Who knows? Um, but the next evidence of agriculture is almost 10,000 years later. So in the mid-20th century, Dorothy Garrod discovered the Natufians, or evidence of the Natufians, when she found a sickle with a bone handle and flint blades in caves on Mount Carmel. That's in Israel. And her team found residues of barley and wheat on the sickle. So these people lived between 15,000 and 12,000 years ago. So they preceded the development of the agricultural revolution. And actually, they took advantage of the wild grains. Researchers have calculated that one person could gather enough wild grain in 3 weeks to feed an entire family for a year. And then grain could be stored and kept for decades. So the Natufians established permanent settlements to store food. And they pounded the grains in mortars and pestles and cooked flat biscuits. They also ate fruits and nuts. So they're looking at their cave locations and analyzing what they ate. And so they actually were able, because they could get so much food in such a short time, they did not have to roam around, but they could set up semi-permanent locations such as this cave. And many of their sites were on the edges of the Jordan Valley. Like I mentioned before, there's springs on the sides of the hills. So this is one of their homes, or at least my derivation of it on Midjourney Bot. To build their homes, they laid out circles of stones and built brush and branch roofs. And then they added terraces in front of the living areas. The Natufian communities generally had 25 to 50 people. And because they brought back fruits and nuts, the discarded seeds sometimes grew into productive trees in the refuse piles near their houses. And so because they did not need to be searching for food all the time, archaeologists have found that they engaged in arts and crafts, and there's some very nice pictures in the text of like their mortars and pestles and some of their other objects. Um, they actually made bone carvings and stone art objects, so just for the purpose of art. They also had an extensive trade system. They were throughout that region, and they traded tools, grains, ideas, decorations, and actually spouses, not meaning they traded spouses, but there was marriage between different clans. And so they had this north-south route along the Jordan Valley and up into the Euphrates in northern Syria. Well, nothing lasts forever. And the Natufians lived in their hunter-gatherer paradise for 2,500 years. But that ended because of something that happened in North America. There was the release of the giant North American giant glacial lake Agassiz into the Atlantic Ocean, which changed the North Atlantic current and caused a worldwide drought, which is called the Younger Dryas Ice Age, between 12,800 and 11,500 years ago. And the drought forced the Natufians to abandon their settlements, and many perished. But a few groups established settlements down at the springs in the Jordan Valley, and that's where they began to plant and water seeds. So that's what's considered the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, a permanent settlement where they're growing crops. And these are the locations of some of their early villages. They had one at Jericho. They had one at Netiv Hagdud and Gilgal. There's one down here at Zahrat ad Dahra or Dara. And there's one to the south in Wadi Finan that's not shown here. But that's down here by the Dead Sea, down here in the Jordan Valley is where they began. And so archaeologists have looked at the skeletons down there, and they've seen that there was a lot of farming injuries due to shoulders and other parts of the body that were used in cultivation and farm work. So it was a difficult life, but at least they were able to survive, you know. They produced their own food by diverting they were actually large springs, but they could divert the springs and they could water the ground around their little village and grow crops and survive. They also had to become more efficient hunters because there wasn't enough game. And so they invented the bow and arrow also. So this is the ancient mound of Jericho. And you can still go there and see it. There's a famous spring here called Ein Sultan Spring. This is the Dead Sea in the background. And I actually looked at Jericho one time. I was over here on the Jordan side of the Dead Sea, and I could see across to Jericho. But that's as close as I got to Jericho. So they had 70 circular dwellings. So they initially built those circular dwellings like the one I showed you by 9,400 BC or 11,400 years ago. And they also developed grain storage to store their grain. They first constructed the granaries between buildings, but later constructed the granaries within residences. And people associate Jericho with walls, but there was a wall at that time, but it was to protect the city from floods from a nearby wash. Okay, let's move on to animal domestication. And so the first example of animal domestication was in Europe, and I think China too. Chinese domesticated some wolves or some kind of animal, and that's where the Chinese dogs came from. But also in Europe, they domesticated, I think, the gray wolf between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago. And then they continued with farm animals in the Middle East, beginning 12,000 years ago. But animals were domesticated that had traits suitable for domestication, which included growth rate, breeding habits, temperament, and herding behavior. So there's lots of animals around, but not all of them are suitable for domestication. Okay, so here's just a sequence of the early sheep. So the early sheep had horns, and they weren't, completely suitable for human use, both in personality. They didn't have long wool coats. I don't, the first sheep that was domesticated did not have long fur. It had very short fur. But anyway, they gradually bred characteristics into the sheep. I think it took 4,000 years to domesticate wool sheep. And then, even in around the world, sheep domestication is still going on. It's a complex process. Now they're using like DNA analysis to identify favorable mutations in genes. And so, it's aided by that, but it's still the same process where they're selecting for positive mutations. And it's a little bit complicated to breed animals. There's a certain way you have to do it, and I forget what it is. But anyway, they can select for certain genetic mutations and have maybe a sheep that's more durable or produces more wool. So the PPNA Natufians hunted with dogs and had dogs as pets. And actually, the first evidence in the world of a dog as a pet was in a Natufian PPNA grave, in which a lady was buried along with her dog. And so maybe they thought that domestication would continue into the afterlife. I'm not sure. And actually, I'm not going to comment on whether dogs go to heaven. But if any dog deserved to go to heaven, it was this poor dog. All right. So Driscoll listed the favorable and unfavorable ecological and behavioral pre-adaptations to domestication for barnyard animals. And so some of the keys to domestication were that the herd should follow a dominant individual. They had to tolerate close quarters. They should be able to adjust to a range of diets. They should not be territorial, and they needed to be willing to breed around people. And the animals should be docile, and if raised for meat, they should grow quickly. But it should not be a meat eater. Notice they haven't domesticated any carnivorous animals, except maybe dogs or cats, but they aren't, going to eat large animals. And I did want to get back to the horse, as I promised in a previous video. And so I just wanted to give you a list of the benefits of horses over the years. They were actually not among the first domesticated animals. I think it was 2000 BC or 3000, and not in the Middle East, but up in the steppes. But it's amazing how much they influenced human lives prior to the Industrial Revolution. And just an example of that is there were 13 million horses in Europe in the 16th century prior to the Industrial Revolution. And then also another amazing thing about animals is they can have personalities and become friends of humans. And so I got this from Agape Pet Services. I'm not going to read it, but you can see that animals really have an amazing effect on humans. Having a dog or a cat or a horse for some people. And so some of the personality characteristics of horses is that they have extremely well-developed senses of smell, hearing, touch, taste, and sight. They're among the most perceptive of domestic animals. They're extremely fast learners, and they have an uncanny memory. And they can also desensitize, meaning they can learn to ignore things that actually do not pose a threat. And as with dogs, horses rely on body language for communication. Okay, let's move on to pre-pottery Neolithic B. So in pre-pottery Neolithic B, there were several large towns or cities, if you want to call them that. And this is just a picture of a early city in Turkey which actually had between 5,000 and 7,000 people. And they constructed their houses together, and then they would walk along the roofs between houses. And then they had these nice little houses where they would go down a ladder into each person's dwelling. And so the interesting thing about this city is it was not a civilization. And the way they define a civilization is there's obvious large administrative building that controlled everybody else, and there was rich people and poor people. As with other Neolithic cultures, this village had everybody's house was the same. And so it wasn't what they would call a civilization, but it was organized. Like they practiced agriculture nearby in a farming area. And so they disposed of their trash in certain ways. And so they were organized. It just wasn't classified as a civilization. Here's the Yang Shao culture in China. And so it's probably the most famous and important Neolithic culture. So this village is from 4,800 to 2,500 BC, although remember I told you that the Neolithic began earlier in China. The reason I show you this village is it was the origin of the Yellow River civilization. And one thing I'd like you to notice, as with other Neolithic cultures, there's no wall around the village. They had very few weapons of war or none, which, as with other Neolithic cultures, indicates that they were peaceful. It wasn't until civilization came that we had walls, weapons of war, class system, and so on. Yeah, notice everybody's house is about the same also. Okay, let's just look at the Americas briefly. This is a Mid-Journey bot representation of a Neolithic village in Peru. So they domesticated potatoes and tomatoes. And the interesting story about the other location in America where there was domestication was in Mexico. That was the domestication of corn. And the way they domesticated it was inedible. It had a very hard crust. But what they could do is they could pop it and make popcorn. So that was the beginning of the domestication of corn. Okay, so this is Lower Mesopotamia. And so now we're focused on the late Neolithic, which began 7,700 years ago. And this was the Ubaid culture. And they originated in about 5,700 BC. And they built all these villages here in Mesopotamia. They also stretched all the way over to Israel, down into Arabia. So they were a very successful culture. And archaeologists actually aren't sure if it was just their culture that spread and other people adopted it, or whether they spread. But anyway, their culture spread, like their building style, their pottery, and other artifacts were seen across this region. As with the other Neolithic cultures, they were peaceful. They also did not have a class system. And also like to point out the location of Eridu, which was the beginning of their culture. And so the early Ubaid began in 5,700 BC in Eridu and Owaili, and they lived on what are called little turtlebacks in the midst of marshes. So I don't know if you've seen the pictures of the southern marshes in southern Iraq, but that's where Eridu was. And the way they would grow their crops is that they would rely on the shallow groundwater to come up and water the crops from below. So they didn't need to irrigate, but they would set up little cropping regions next to the wetlands and grow their crops. Eventually they started, oh, I didn't mention, these are their reed huts, which are very famous. And actually the marsh Arabs in Iraq still make these same kind of mud heap reed huts. But eventually they started building buildings from dried mud blocks. And so they had what's called a buttress recess architecture. And temples were always an important part of the Ubaid villages. They had what's called an offering table where they sacrificed animals. And they were the first examples of animal sacrifice in the world. Also, another interesting thing about them is they had no evidence of idols. Like most of these cultures had idols in their temples. And this might be an early Ubaid, what an early Ubaid village looked like in central Iraq. So this is not in the wetlands, but along the Tigris River. And so again, there was no elites with large houses. Everybody was pretty much the same. Um, there's no indication of a class system. And archaeologist Frank Hull thinks that if the elites did not control people during the Ubaid period, then ritual must have controlled them. And the many temples indicate that there was a broadly shared religious ideology, which with the leaders probably also doubling as priests. And another interesting thing about the irrigation, which I haven't mentioned, the rivers were above the level of the ground. What happens in a really flat area is they sort of build themselves up and create side walls. And so they could, by gravity, move the water from the rivers or from canals that they made to their farms. And so that was the key to irrigation is it's too much work to lift water up and irrigate your crops, as you might imagine. You need to use gravity. So that was the key there. In the Nile River Valley, they didn't actually irrigate. They just let the natural flooding wet the soil, and then they would grow winter wheat just on the water that came from the flooding. And so this just shows maybe a typical picture of a little canal. And like I said before, the plow was really key to developing agriculture. And so this was the basis of their civilization. They had many different types of animals, sheep, oxen, cows, and so on. And also they would hunt animals in down in the wetlands areas like southern Iraq, they had a lot of pigs. One of the interesting things about their culture is they practiced head shaping. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that, but they would wrap the baby skulls early on, and then they would expand the back of the skull outward. I guess they thought that was beautiful. But I think they adopted that from an Iranian group, which they intermarried with. And then it's likely that the Ubaid people formed the Uruk culture. So the early Uruk period began in 4000 BC. So the Ubaid period ended, the Uruk culture began in Mesopotamia, the same people. And so that's when they established cities and civilization. And after the initial establishment of these cities, they became colonialist and they colonized like different distant areas. And there's evidence that they killed people that didn't conform with their wishes. So they became very violent and materialistic in contrast with the early Ubaid. And actually, they also established temples with idols and such. They worshipped Iana, the goddess Iana in Uruk, and Anu. So there's just, it was a complete change. So in 3500 BC, there was a massive flood called the Great Flood that covered all of Mesopotamia. And there was some question about this, but recently Al-Sheikhli drilled boreholes throughout Iraq or Mesopotamia from Baghdad area all the way down to Basra. Persian Gulf is down here. And I transferred the locations of his boreholes and transects of boreholes to this map. So that's why this is here. And the interesting thing is that he referred to the Great Flood layer as a reference date for all the boreholes on this map. So obviously the Great Flood extended all the way west and east and north south across Mesopotamia. And so Sir Charles Woolley, who you may have heard of, and actually Here's Agatha Christie and his assistant Max Mallowan. I don't know if you've heard of Agatha Christie. Have you guys heard of her? She wrote books, mystery novels, like murder novels, and they made movies from her books. But anyway, she was married to Woolley's colleague, Max Mallowan. So it's kind of an interesting story. And actually, there's a movie, a murder movie, but there was no murders there, I don't think, based on the expedition to Ur, where they excavated many, many famous artifacts. So Sir Charles Woolley is Sir Charles Woolley because he discovered so many great things. But anyway, he is the one who discovered the Great Ur flood there at Ur, and based on the height of the flood at certain parts of the city, he said the flood was 8 meters deep. So I did a little analysis. I'm an irrigation engineer, so I can do some hydraulics. And so this is a graph of the water surface level versus the base of the valley. So it's a very flat valley from Baghdad down to Basra. This is the water surface elevation, and this is distance from Baghdad. And so he said it was 8 meters deep. So I did a calculation that in order to have 8 meters deep floodwater at Ur, the storm would have to be 90 billion cubic meters per day. And that's about twice the largest storm in recorded American history, which was Hurricane Harvey in Texas. There's never been a flood in Mesopotamia since then that's been even remotely close to the scale and flow of the Great Ur flood. In the early days, I have the storm right over Mesopotamia, but then I have most of the water coming in from the Euphrates later on in the simulation. Okay, so Sir Leonard Woolley observed in his archaeological investigation that the population surrounding Ur was decimated by this flood. And the way he did this was to dig pits. And he observed that there's no human artifacts above the flood layers. And so he said that Ur was depopulated. And then more recently, McMahon observed that Uruk, the city of Uruk, was depopulated at the same time. And so she said that the people coming back in after 3500 BC were probably immigrants, which agrees with the fact that the Sumerians who came later were Black. And so this ends the Neolithic period in Mesopotamia. And then next week, we'll discuss the beginnings of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt during the Bronze Age. So I went out and there's not much interesting philosophical viewpoints on the Neolithic, but there are a lot of philosophical viewpoints on Noah's flood. And so atheists actually think there was a flood in Mesopotamia or a series of floods that led to the Noah's flood myth in the Bible, what they call the Noah's flood myth. And theistic evolutionists, they would also say that the Noah's flood myth was based on floods in Mesopotamia, but they would say it was a real flood that, was actually not theistic evolutionists. They're pretty much like the atheists. But the progressive creationists would say there was some real flood that occurred that was massive. And then the young earth creationists, of course, they believe the whole world was flooded by Noah's flood. Okay, so I think myself that Adam and Eve and Noah's flood have a high level of correlation with events in late Neolithic Mesopotamia. So I made a few videos on those, which you can access here. And so there's also a document that'll be below the video that you can access that describes some of these things. All right, we'll see you next time.